Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I am an educator of philosophy based in Austin. Welcome to our very first episode. I'm here with my great friend, Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi everyone, my name is Chen. I'm also based in Austin. I'm a comparative culture historian of early medieval Europe, early medieval Europe, and late medieval China. It's great to be here with you, Aaron.
Yes, indeed. So what we are going to do in this episode, which is, as you can see, this is episode 0. This is a form of manifesto, if you wish, a form of kind of telling to you guys why we are here, what is the reason for us to do this. And you know, it's a lot of it's hard work, and there are all sorts of podcasts out there. There are people who are creating content in all sorts of ways. Like, what makes us want to do this? What is the feeling that is pushing us to do this? Because for both of us, there is a need for doing this. This is not just some extra random, like, you know, we might do it, we might not do it. We feel an urge, and that is the energy of these discussions, and you're going to see that. So what we want to do with this very first episode is to share with you where we come from and how we got here, how we got to this urge, how we got to this need to have these conversations and share it with others. And to do that, I want to start with a very short biography of myself in terms of what has been my path in philosophy. And then we're going to see how that gets tied up with Tren's path in his studies, and how our frustrations and desires kind of intertwine. I was born in Iran, and I have lived most of my life in Iran, 23 years in Iran, 7 years in the States. So my formative years, I was not in the US. I was not, definitely not in Austin. And I did not study philosophy in Iran in any sort of academic sense. And it was with me, like it was there. And as soon as I started doing my bachelor's in mechanical engineering, for reasons very different than why most people do mechanical engineering, as soon as I started doing that, I just realized that this need for philosophy, this desire for philosophy, this seeing philosophy as a form of satisfaction is not something that I could just evade. It's not something that I could just push aside and just, you know, maybe a random philosophy book here and there. No, it became an urge. It became a desire. It was very vague, right? Because I didn't have the academic structure. Now, with some friends and with my own attempts, I just tried to find my way around this. And what happened was that in my attempts to do philosophy, I got to know some people, and I got to read some books. And all of those activities were in a non-academic, non-bureaucratic structure. And that's partially because of Iran's society and the restrictions on, the discussions that you can have, all sorts of problems that exist. But whatever it is, philosophy happens at the periphery of institutions, formalized institutions. And there are all sorts of random events and places and people who are doing philosophy without having any recognizable credentials from a Western perspective. And the mere situatedness of where philosophy happens itself is a very unique and different from a place like the US. So just as an example, one of my main mentors who passed away a few years ago used to be a political prisoner, went to Germany after serving his prison time, started to do high school at the age of like 38, and kind of got a PhD in philosophy. I'm not even sure if he finished it, but he was interested in the problems of Iran and he came back to Iran, but he was, because of these political past, he was not able to, work at the university level. So we would go to his friend's architecture firm and read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And this whole picture, this image is, for me, I didn't know how philosophy was done in the US. So that was how I was doing it. And it is also worth mentioning, because it's going to be important, that for a lot of people that read philosophy in Iran, there is this, the root cause of getting dragged into philosophy a lot of times is the socio-political problems in Iran, right? There is this kind of attempt to figure out why we're struggling, what is our struggle, what is a good state, to answer to those questions, what more basic questions we need to answer. So that was also something very powerful there, as like a matter of the overall vibe of who is around philosophy in Iran, like who is interested in philosophy. Right? So it is very non-academic, non-bureaucratic. It's not very accurate scholarship. All sorts of people, they don't have any degrees, but they have read like all works of like Heidegger, like all sorts of random people that you would not expect them to be any sort of respectable figure in an academic setup in the US. They are doing philosophy. And of course, intricacies were lost, nuances were lost. There is no structure to this, but there is passion, there is movement, there is a flow, there is a life. And for me, because my interest in philosophy was like that, and the environment that I was in was like that, I thought that this is what philosophy is, or better said, this is what philosophers will look like anywhere. I came to the States, I went to college for a year, and then I applied for my master's. I started doing my master's at San Francisco State University. And it was soon after that that I realized that not at all. This is not what philosophers look like everywhere. And the type of problems that I faced, we're going to talk about them in details because they're going to get intertwined with trans problems with academia. But it is worth mentioning that at no place in this discussion, this is not a youth rebel against academic order. This is not like we try to like eradicate academia or just say that it is useless and it has not. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot with a lot of these classes that is structured, that, standard of review of papers, like all of this stuff has helped me, shaped me, informed me, and made me better thinker in a lot of ways in terms of like forcing me to articulate myself and be accountable to certain standards, right? It's none of this that we are going to talk about is going against what academia is and philosophy must be done in a jungle. Like it's not that type of criticism. However, what we feel is happening is there is something inherently unsatisfying about how the academic structure attempts to satisfy reason. In other words, reason remains unsatisfied in this bureaucratic regime of academic scholarship. And just to point out the very basic like structure that we have established with Tran as like the main points of lacking, I will mention those. Then we will get to Tran's story, and then we will continue elaborating on these points.
Right.
One is the problem of hyper-specialization. The second problem is the absence of basic level critical attitude, self-criticism, comprehensive self-criticism, and the lack of open-ended, dialectically developing projects. Lack of a space for allowing such open-ended, dialectically developing projects to flourish. We're going to talk about all of these points in details, but let's go to Tren, and we will, through his story, we will get to more details of what we mean by these lags.
Right. Thanks a lot, Aran, for laying the ground for this discussion, which I consider our episode 0, which is very different from the rest of or the future of this episode, which will be text-based, content-based. This is more like a confession, a pledge, a sworn oath of eternal fellowship to describe or articulate our vision and our dissatisfaction with the reality of knowledge structures we are encountering. And I've heard your life story numerous times, but every time I hear it, I still feel very much moved and shaken to the core. So thanks again for sharing your story. My story, on the other hand, sounds pretty banal. I was born and raised in China, and like numerous millions of kids of my generation, we were single child and sent into a pipeline of education. Public education in China, I imagine similarly in Iran or some other developing countries, rendered a lot of emphasis on abstraction. And this abstraction is not supplemented with intuitive empirical knowledge. For instance, I will learn a lot about the structure of a flower, but I was never taken to the field and observe any flower, that kind of thing. So, and also education is associated with prestige, with class status, with power. So it was a means towards an end. I never understood as a kid why I was forced to learn like abstract algebra, stuff like that, until I really entered my undergraduate in Hong Kong, where I started to explore completely different knowledge system that is Western and British. However, initially I was very idealistic. Wow, finally I can breathe free because I'm liberated from that inhibiting structure which I was born into. However, just like your ground disillusion after your migration to the US, your experience with the professional scholars of philosophy, there I learned it the hard way, the problem of hyper-specialization. For instance, I was greatly interested in two things, and I will further develop it as we go into the second and third point, that is modernity and the role cultural identities or memory would play in the realization of modernity, right? So the way I approach it, or just based on intuition in my undergraduate formation, in the choice of major, I chose economics because it's all about the distribution of resources, the personal preferences that are under scrutiny, yada, yada, yada. But however, whenever we reach to the basic point that whence do we derive this buffered autonomous individuals who basically is a world or an island to his or herself, whenever I ask such questions, my professor would just say, well, Chen, do not overcomplicate your life. And I was thinking to myself in silence, I'm not complicating my life. I ask that simply because I'm dissatisfied. I want to know where you got your assumptions from. And then the professor will usually point to the directions, well, walk down the road, 1 block, you'll reach the Department of Sociology. They might have an answer for you. And there we go. I took courses in sociology. Then still the question about the value rationalities, moral convictions, compartmented. When I asked them, where did such convictions come from? They, well, go 1 more block down, you will reach the religious studies department, and we don't handle that. And right now, here I am in religious studies department in the US doing my PhD, and fundamental analytical categories, the fundamental convictions about world views are still not satisfying. So I thought, perhaps like philosophy is the only place for me to do that. So even though I'm not a professional philosophy, I've never received formal philosophy education, I become very interested in philosophy. That's how our path, I suppose, around cross. But that doesn't seem the case in your understanding. Hyper-specialization still permeates and in a way structures how philosophy is done. Would you like to elaborate that after perhaps I summarize my intellectual trajectory? That is, hyper-specialization really limits my realization of my intellectual curiosity, because there seems some fundamental questions backed in every discipline. So they try to come up with the justifications, be it religious studies, be it sociology, be it economics, try to use local resources. That is the history of the discipline or the canon. I don't know, arbitrarily, not necessarily arbitrarily, but contingently selected and sanctioned by the history and the institution to come up with a justification of their autonomy, yet cutting itself from those fundamental questions, which I think all social sciences and the humanities disciplines actually rest upon. That is a question about what is thinking, what does it mean to be human, what is culture, and how do we get to know what we know? How do we get sense of confidence in taking our understanding of theory into practice? Those questions are not really embraced and engaged with, in my understanding, in any discipline I'm exposed to. So would you please tell us about your understanding of philosophy in specific?
Yeah, this is very interesting, because now that you said it, it also I remembered another thread of my own path,
right,
which is very similar to what you said. Because like you like my interest in philosophy is not I once saw a man at UC Berkeley, right, and he told me, and this is going to be related to this whole point about hyper-specialization. So we were chatting, and at some point of it, he said, "Yeah, I'm a logic geek." And I'm like, that's a very odd kind of like relationship to philosophy. Like, I just enjoy doing logic, just like people enjoy playing D&D. That was his attitude of like of why he was doing philosophy. But that was not my interest in philosophy. So I was interested in all of these, like economics, history, all of that. But the trouble that I had, like I wasn't convinced of philosophy from the very beginning. But the trouble was that you open an economics book, and there is like this assumption about what human beings are: atomized, rational, like discrete individuals, right? Definitely. And okay, that might be a useful assumption. That might open up some doors. But where did we get that assumption? That was not the assumption of human beings in the medieval times. I don't think so. I don't think that has been like there are, at least it's in terms of like historical analysis. That's not something that we already have agreed all the time about like that's oh yeah, that's who we are. That's not at all. But it seems so casual and so immense. Like if you start with that, then of course you will get a system out of it. Right. But in the middle of that, you would just forget that okay, this is all based on that basic assumption. And right. I was interested in that basic assumption, just where you were like interested in just okay, where did we get this? Okay, right. Ask the sociologist. So I wasn't kind of thrown around in this way that you were by like academic figures, but it was like I did the same, and that's how I landed at philosophy. Because to me, philosophy is still think this. Philosophy is the domain that such basic questions are asked. Right. If philosophy is also like, okay, we just assume like in the same way that we assume in all of these areas, and it's not that the point is not we don't reach where we want to reach. Now, right. With that energy, with that desire, with that ambition, I entered the professional setup of doing philosophy in academia. But there are some fascinating and absurd and disturbing facts about how philosophy is done in the 21st century America, and how much of this is true about philosophy that is done in the West in general, I'm not sure. But in America, I have a good view of what is going on, because it's not just about I was at Sanford State. I audited many courses at UC Berkeley. I've been to conferences. I have talked to people, faculty from all sorts of universities, and also the trajectory of what is being published. What are we doing as people with this kind of degrees? This is not something that is hidden anywhere.
Right.
So what happens is that when you enter the domain of philosophy, there are some very rigid specializations, rigid distinctions. For instance, history of philosophy versus contemporary philosophy, right? I have been actively dissuaded from connecting history of philosophy to contemporary philosophy. I have heard from my professors that they have tried to do that, but they decided it doesn't worth it, right? It's not gonna get the recognition, right? So if you do history of philosophy, you're not doing contemporary philosophy. What does that even mean? Like, you're a historian of philosophy? That's not how great philosophers thought about history of philosophy. Like, of course, Hegel read Aristotle, but he didn't think about himself that, oh, I just focus on history of philosophy. The history of philosophy was connected to contemporary philosophy, as Hegel was a contemporary figure, right? When Spinoza reads Descartes, he's not reading Descartes as a historical figure, as if that historical figure has nothing to do with the questions that are contemporary to Spinoza. Right. Just like a very odd, rigid distinction. So now, like, go look at all the rankings of departments for PhDs in philosophy. Right. They are categorized based on this. That, okay, Brown University is very good at Kant, but NYU is very good at philosophy of language. What if Kant talked about philosophy of language? Like, what happened to that? Like, there are departments that are specializing on metaphysics, but there are some that are specialized on 18th century philosophy. What were the 18th century philosophers were doing other than metaphysics? Like, how the distinction between this just recognized, appreciated, acknowledged, and maintained that, oh, okay, like, you go to the pages of, like, philosophy departments, we are very good at philosophy of art here. Like, that's what we specialize in. Like, it's just very, like, out there. It's naked. It's nothing to hide. And it gets worse, and it gets far worse, because, okay, I'm doing history of philosophy, right? Again, you are kind of pushed to choose, right? Don't choose Aristotle, Spinoza, and Hegel, right? These are just two, like, not connected, right? Get to, like, I'm working on 19th century, like, German philosophy, right? And don't, not Nietzsche and Kant and Hegel, not all of them, right? Just, like, pick one. And the structure, okay, like, I have picked one, or, I have forced to pick one. Now, we want to write. Okay, and in that, writing includes writing for classes. It could include writing for writing sample for PhD applications, writing during the time at a PhD, getting a PhD, publishing. This is the pattern that is going to get continued. You do not talk about Hegel in a broad sense. You do not talk about you do not engage just directly with the text. You got to bring the secondary literature, right? And that will give you the points. You bring in the secondary literature and Hegel, but you don't bring, like, Zizek and Pippin. You're too far away. Like, we'll talk about Hegel, but they are not there. You pick people who are mostly agree with everything that what Hegel was talking about. And you don't talk about their general approach to Hegel at all. you pick like a debate that they have about something, like chapter 4 of phenomenology of a spirit, the concept of desire. It was just John McDowell talking about it this way, Pippin talk about it this other way. Let's just, put them against one another, right? And you kind of like find a resolution to this debate, that you say McDowell says this, Pippin says this other thing, then you will have a solution to that. Okay, so look what has happened.
Right.
Picked history of philosophy over contemporary philosophy, which is itself the most saddening and absurd move, because I am self-exiling myself. I am accepting my irrelevance to any philosophical question that is presented in the contemporary setup. Right. I'm like, no, I'm working on Hegel. That's what I do, right? Okay. And I'm not working on Hegel in this comprehensive way. I'm working on Hegel in this very minute way, right? You're always directed to go tiny.
Right.
4 pages, 10 pages, 1 chapter. You're not going to talk about the whole book, right? You're going to do that kind of a scholarly work. And then I do that, and by deciding which camp of a scholarship I'm going to focus on, I've already like excluded myself with establishing any conversation with other scholars of Hegel, right? So not only I am exiled in this weird historical terrain, I am definitely not talking to Leibniz people, right? Maybe in the passing, but we don't have an active conversation about Hegel and Leibniz. There could be some people who quote unquote try to bridge these like with different strategies, but that's not the course is not that that would be an exception. I'm doing Hegel. I got to know the history of philosophy insofar as kind of relevant to understanding that, but that's what I do. And I am, when doing that, of course, I need to adopt a specific type of jargon that's used by data scholars in that field. Okay. Now, only think about this in terms of language, like in terms of what happens to language. Now, to a person that is outside like this academic madness, that is interested in philosophy, now they ask me, what do I do? And I'm already in this weird conditioning system in a place of being absolutely incapable of doing what I'm doing.
Right.
Other than just mentioning it in this weird way that I work on history of philosophy, this is the figure that I'm working on, this is the chapter I'm working on, and this concept is there, right? Okay. Right. Who cares? Like, what is this happening? Okay, why is this even happening? Okay. So, and there is something about this point that you will see this over again. Like this is the exact words that I heard from one of my advisors, that like I was working in more broadly in Kant and Hegel. He told me all of these things that got to narrow down, debate, camps. There are one camp of readers, and he said they want the writing sample to be like this, because when you get to the PhD program, they want you to read their scholarship, and like do this thing again. And when do I read Hegel then, like as in its entirety, in engaging with the man himself? Now, there is this terrifying comfort or lack of discomfort in being irrelevant that is very prevalent in the philosophical domain. So you are not, in no way you are invited to be ambitious, grand, expansive, comprehensive, and systematic. You are invited to be pedantic, scholarly, and irrelevant. That's the invitation. Now, you gotta resist the invitation, and things emerge that are more interesting. But there is no active force to say that, okay, Leibniz said something. Let's translate that into a language that is relevant to what we're talking about right now. And the contemporary philosophy also becomes something very odd and awkward, because now it's just like, it is kind of rootless, right? It's like as if like these questions are free-floating questions that we never, we just, let's just do it. The history of philosophy is garbage. Let's just talk about these questions.
Right.
Or it becomes like an assistant to natural sciences, losing that kind of a critical force completely.
Right.
And with all of these things, that desire that we both have of going to the basics and asking questions and be daring to challenge the most basic assumptions, insofar as those assumptions are very much relevant to our already existing domains of knowledge, is absolutely missing as the main energy of the field. It is creating scholar after scholar after scholar after scholar, paper after paper after paper after paper. And none of this is about saying that, oh, we don't need to read, we don't need to be accurate, we don't need to be articulate. Hegel read Kant, Kant read Hume, Aristotle read Plato. All of these people in different ways wrote on those philosophers, right? They have works that are dealing with the ideas of those philosophers. They have courses in history of philosophy like Hegel that is published. That is just, he goes over all of these people. But their relationship with the history of philosophy, the thought of other people, was absolutely different from this. This is at the very beginning. There is this assumption that nothing is going to change. At the very core, what could change at the most is that now we have a new interpretation of chapter 4 of Hegel's phenomenology. Right. Who gives a damn? Outside these 50 people in the world that care about that camp of scholarship of Hegel, where is that like line that connects this to anything else? Right. As an active force. So that is also like that is about the hyper-specialization, but that pushes us to the point about lack of critical approach, right? The basic assumptions are just there, and no attempt to connection is made, no attention to challenging basic ideas is there, right? And in the face of this self-accepted irrelevance of the field that its work is to challenge to challenge those basic assumptions, right? To me, to get rid is castrating philosophy, right? Philosophy is nothing without that kind of a force. And when you get rid of that force, then you have something, but it turns into this kind of intellectual masturbation that is without any productive force behind it. And the problem is not that we might fail. The problem is that we don't even attempt.
Right. I think there's a very important connection between the first two points you raised, that is hyper-specialization and lack of self-criticism or radical self-criticism, because hyper-specialization could continue at a large scale as a social action only because members of this knowledge-producing enterprise acquiesced the way knowledge is produced, that is guided by some predetermined or contingently determined categories, like the separation between history of philosophy and the contemporary philosophy, or the camps, as if they had real substance. So their creative talent, their productivity are not encouraged or channeled towards a reconsideration of these, in fact, fluid and to a certain extent arbitrary distinctions or differentiation, but rather to further the trajectory of which the motion and direction was set at the very beginning before even their intellectual formation. So do you want to further elaborate that? Perhaps use like people we really admire, like 19th century German philosophers, as a counterpoint, like how do you think they were doing philosophy other than just reading previous philosophers, and how did they communicate with each other, and what do you think was crucial for their self-expression, but it's lacking in our time.
Yeah, I think there are some interesting points to mention that we can see in Greek philosophers, we can see in a lot of even medieval figures that we might not even know.
That is very kind.
Yeah, in the sense that they might not have survived as great philosophers, but I think the urge, the energy was the same. And I think what one of the things is that when someone like Hegel engages with history of philosophy, he engages insofar as he thinks they are necessary for those basic questions,
Indeed.
those basic philosophical questions, but they're still unsatisfying, right? So he took inspiration, influence, and resources from those people to build a system of thinking that answers and reconstructs a way of answering those basic questions. So the desire is very different. You see that in Hegel, you see that in Kant, that they are interested in not only answering a very tiny a scholastic question or like a scholarship of someone else, but they're interested in, they understand, I think there is an understanding there, that to answer one, you need to answer many. And that insight has been lost, that we now think that we can answer questions in political philosophy without answering any questions about epistemology. And we can answer questions about epistemology without asking any question about philosophy of art, right? And what you see in a figure like Plato, in a figure like Aristotle, in a figure like Spinoza, in a figure like Kant and Hegel, is that they build this interconnected organism of a kind. I want to, I'm refraining from using system because there are some people like maybe Nietzsche that has that interest in interconnectedness, but he's suspicious of the word system. But the point is not that. The point is this going to the basic, going to the basic and asking those basic questions and reconstructing the meaning of knowledge, which means the location of disciplines is going to change, right? The fact that we distinguish economics from philosophy and philosophy from history, the way that we do it, I'm not saying it is absolutely wrong. I'm not saying that there is like a ready-made alternative there, but there is a question about that. And that question is very much valid, because if economics is based on a very basic assumption about human nature, and philosophy is one of the main tasks of philosophy is ask that question, why are these fields so fundamentally detached? Like, in what sense, what are we trying to get at that makes this distinction like meaningful, right? So this organization of knowledge, this basic questions of how things get related and how they don't get related, that insight we feel an atrophy, right? We feel a muscle that is not being used, that in different areas in that era, you will see, like in the 19th century, especially 18th and 19th century, yet again another jab at this very basic level of questions and a very basic organization and principles that play with one another, to talk to one another. They find their way to the thoughts of people like Humboldt, and that will create some ideas about what education is. Like, it's just, there is a conversation between all of these people at that very basic level. Not just like I am doing like philosophy of education at this very kind of a benign, I have assumed almost anything, almost everything to be in the right place. Now let me have a tiny bit of a change. No, we need new types of universities. That's the energy of like that kind of era. We need a new form of establishing knowledge. That's the idea, and that's something that is at loss. And before getting to your insights about this critical point, and that beautiful metaphor that you have in terms of the circuits. I want to mention something that it is relevant to understanding these discussions that we're going to have. We're going to tell you guys what a structure you should expect from us. But I want to point at something that has happened that I think is a very clear response to this unsatisfactory structure of philosophical inquiry in our times. And that's this satisfaction with irrelevance.
Right.
And that's the emergence of self-help, like philosophy-inspired type of books. Right. That there is this kind of like implicit, like sometimes explicit statement that okay, no, philosophy you think is irrelevant, but let me tell you why it's not. Let's go take Seneca and kind of extract some life lessons from Seneca, and now we have made philosophy relevant again, right? Like we just go there, we get some lessons for life. Some like Stoicism is very good in that, like Epicure, like pre-Socratic philosophers. Some, yes, there are many figures that fit into that kind of category, which is in some ways very interesting, in some ways expanding, at least giving some sort of a reading room of like someone who is justifiably afraid and disgusted by seeing philosophy to be just this kind of a weird rabbit hole of a scholarship, that are just like, okay, now there is something, we can talk about this. But that comes at the cost of losing one of the main points about this kind of a 19th century energy that you mentioned, which is going deep, going to the core, right? Because Stoicism is not a very stable system of thinking, and it needs criticism. But if we stop there and say, okay, let's extract that, not only that might come at the cost of simplification, which might be fine to a level, but just that reason is still unsatisfied. You see, reason is still does not get its satisfaction of that basic level of inquiry. And that's what our discussions are going to be about. But before we get to the point, you have something to add, I think.
Absolutely. As your observation of the merge of a self-help type of a philosophy book is a very astute, and I will refer back to it in a second. But for me, sometimes I ask myself, while reading, say, the life story, the ambition, the grand stature of being human as a vision in the 19th century, and look around myself and inspect myself, I cannot help but wondering, is that just an inevitable decline of a human capability or talent? You see that in all kinds of myths. The world is declining, yada, yada, yada. Yet, through my really exciting encounter with ambitious and creative individuals like you and a lot of other friends, I don't think that's the case. Instead, I think it's what set us apart from those precursors of such courageous attempters is the lack of space. That for them, they were at a very interesting point in history where the old structure was challenged but not discarded completely. Aristocratic patronage, a desire for long-term plan vision was still strong and dear to people's heart. But on the other hand, market economy, industrialization was within the horizon, and different people who were not born into a specific class were given the opportunity to realize themselves through education, also things. So it's a very interesting dynamic, which is fluid enough for ambitious people to get around, but also robust and stable enough to envision a long-term game. And that, I think, is precisely what is lacking in our time. It's not that we are dumbed down as a group, but rather we haven't yet found a way to forge such a mutually beneficiary and inspiring network of ideas. And go back to the point that you anticipated, that is I think a fitting metaphor here is the concept of electricity and a circuit. So, electricity is power in our society. It creates a lot of things. Whenever you have a power outage, you cannot do many things. That's why we call it a power. Our power is not stable. It does not reside when our knowledge or our desire or dissatisfaction remains dormant. It manifests and it brings us about a change when we are becoming each other's outlet. We're becoming each other's conduit. I allow you to present your most genuine and creative intellectual self and pass it on. Let it have a great long-lasting imprint on myself and pass it along to people around me. I think the lack of such a space is really detrimental to the blossoming or the budding of such great class of ideas. That's the main difference between our time and the 19th century. Yet I'm fundamentally a optimist, which might sound very counterintuitive. And I'm also very Confucian in a way that I believe genuine engagement with individuals are able to foster such long-lasting and trusting social relationship, which would eventually bring about such a productive network, such power plant of great ideas, ambitious attempts, so to speak. That's why I think after years of a conversation between you and me, this podcast was finally conceived. We want to use this as the frontier to find the ground, to invite like-minded people who are willing to pledge to this noble cause and foster such a contemporary, yet encompassing both past and future community of both knowledge and vision. Yes, so that's all I want. Can you move on to maybe our next point?
Yeah, so that's great, and I love that image, and I love that picture. And one last thing that I want to add is the third point that we have briefly talked about, and I think at this point it is somehow clear how we think of that as something detrimental and how we want to combat that here. And that's the problem that all of these ambitions, basic level attempts, finding the connections, establishing the connections, opening up, and bringing this type of self-criticism to the very basic assumptions of thought is impossible to pursue.
Right.
If the task that you are given is to write a proposal that is a couple of pages long,
right,
and you have to have your conclusion already expressed there, and your method. What is that?
And your method and the data.
Yeah, exactly. The method must be clear. The conclusion must be clear. Everything is just done. The only thing that you need to do is to just do it, right? It's just like that's like you already know where you're gonna get, which is a very for listeners who do not know, this is a very common structure in philosophy and humanities, and that if you are writing a proposal for anything, they want you to be clear, narrow, and give us basically what you're going to arrive at and tell us how you're going to arrive at it at the beginning.
Right.
Which is, as me and Trent were talking about this a few days ago, envisioning what would Hegel's proposal, for his logic, right?
Science of logic.
It's very funny to me that people who are interested in Hegel still really enjoy this type of proposals. Because if you're a Hegelian, right, you know that the end cannot be simply stated, right? You cannot just state the conclusion.
Right.
So it's a very anti-Hegelian instinct. As we're going to talk about Hegel later on in these episodes, it might become clear to you listeners what this means. But the idea basically is that if I am, first of all, thinking of that kind of a basic questioning, I can have some clues of where this is going to get at. I can give the clues. I can have some guesses of what paths I should take.
Right.
But it's not, the end is not, if the end is clear,
Right.
my project is pedantic. The only way that I could have the conclusions ready at hand is to have a million assumptions just accepted.
Right.
Yes, it's worth doing this the way Hegel does, and it's worth taking this chapter, and it is worth taking this camp, and it's worth to talk about this concept, and it's the way that you talk about it is kind of like this, and it's kind of like, the conclusion should kind of like what this other person has said. Let me add a little bit to that. Yes, you can do that. You could do that. Proposal is possible. But
Right.
if your ambition and desire is to write something like Hegel's logic,
Indeed.
write something like Kant's critique of pure reason, write something like Spinoza's ethics, then this is absurd.
Mm-hmm.
This type of knowing the end at the beginning and is stated clearly in its conclusion and its method, is just basically not doing much. Like, there might be some movement, but you can only add a little bit of like a twist to an already existing trajectory, which is all right if you're thinking about philosophy as a career of a scholar.
Right.
But it's not all right if you're thinking about philosophy the way Nietzsche and Hegel and Kant and Aristotle thought about it, as this grandiose, just gigantic task of going deep and deep. And when I say philosophy, I want to mention that there is this kind of conversation, because at this very basic level, there's all of these disciplinary, distinctions also become loose. So we don't know when we will need history in this inquiry. That's another thing. Like, if I take Hegel seriously, I must take history seriously. But if I am in the philosophy department, I get dissuaded to just like state abstractly something about history, but don't engage with the history. That shouldn't be part of your dissertation, right? Because you're doing philosophy, and philosophy is what? Yeah, it's just not history, right? Or like if I am talking about just economics. No, you're not going to include that. Well, if it's the thing that needs to be included,
right,
then what is stopping me from doing it is only the bureaucratic structure. There's no meaningful, philosophically justified reason for why I should maintain the limits. Now, I understand for this bureaucratic system of education, not everyone is ambitious. Not everyone is capable of taking this path. Not anyone will want to take the risk, and that's fine. That's one way to do it, and there is a contribution that comes from that side. But what if I want to do it? And that gets back to the point about the space that you were talking about, right? That where is this space for doing this? It seems like that in 19th century, there was that a space. It seems like in the Greek time, in the Greek society, ancient Greek society, there was that a space. Where is that a space now? Are we done? Like we have solved everything? Like we all know what is going on? There is no basic way to ask questions anymore? That sounds like a very odd assumption, at least. It might be a conclusion, must be shown. I haven't seen it. Right. And it's not that the philosophy department's the first course is just tell you why like the basic questions are all answered and we're just adding the details. There's not a part. And one last thing that I'm gonna say is that, like, first of all, in these discussions, we are gonna have that kind of open-endedness and not assumption. But just to give you an image of like what kind of people are getting produced in this system of this system of hyper-specialization, lack of that pursuit of that self-criticism, and which you pointed out one of our discussions, that even failure in pursuing that self-criticism is like the failure of a Greek tragic hero.
Yes.
that failure is much more beautiful than a person. I remember I was auditing a course. I'm not going to name the person, but I was auditing a course of a very famous philosopher. And in the midst of the lecture, he was just like, yeah, this is just my job. I'm paid to talk about this. Like, think about that. Think about someone saying that as a philosophy instructor. And think about a system that made him
famous,
be on top,
right?
Made him be on top of the pyramid of what we call contemporary philosophy. So with that, I will give the floor to you if you have anything to add to this point about open-ended conversation, and kind of use that to transition to like what topics we're gonna talk about. What is this open-ended mean for us?
Yes. I think the second half of my personal current struggle would be very helpful to be presented here, because it's very much connected with how the three main points of dissatisfaction we both have for the more contemporary system of education are interconnected. That is, I totally agree with you that the lack of open-ended inquiry to a certain extent perpetuates this formally closed knowledge structure, that you already know the boundary of specific discipline, specific limit of a question before even attempting it. And that translates to the two themes very dear to my heart. One is modernity, the other is a cultural identity and a memory, in a very personal and emotional way. For instance, there's a famous Italian saying, traduttore traditore. The translator is a traitor. Why so? Because you're taking information from a original or source language or literary system and reassemble it according to the logic of the target language. And then that's how I understand, as I'm a comparative cultural historian, but compose and write and think in English. I feel to a certain extent conflicted allegiance. So where does my cultural identity sit in this act of translation? Is cross-cultural translation even possible? It seems that different cultures, knowledge systems have fundamentally different yet isolated assumptions. But the thing is this kind of understanding of culture as isolated and rest on fixed set of assumption is indeed a hallucination, the illusion impressed upon us, given this formally closed knowledge system. So in order to treat any material meaningfully, we must first find a tag, a name for that set of phenomena, for that set of data. Otherwise, we cannot process them and translate them into our formally closed system of knowledge. Therefore, any critique of contemporary, like so-called counter Eurocentric argument, usually is replace a set of fixed assumptions or convictions with another one. And in so doing, plus ça change, plus la même chose. We are not changing the formally closed knowledge system. We're just translating external material and process them in a way that is native to this system and feed this monster so that it will one day convince everybody, regardless of the life experience of their like original cultural like a background, saying this is the only way to go. And that's why I think a fundamental question of like to the core reflection on such basic premises, like where do we get this analytical categories at the first place, which assumptions are hidden yet still so impactful in the way we think, are fundamental not just for the future of philosophy, but also to the future of a modern global society. That is modernity a global concept, or is it a concept that envisioned in Europe and right now exclusively possessed by the West? what do, say, Iranian or Chinese experience or any other experience that have to add to that? Would a conversation between different cultural systems necessarily be presented in a way closer to something Huntington describes as clash of civilization? Or are there better ways to do that? Those are all questions implied and included in this enterprise, because our journey, our heroic, perhaps tragic endeavor is open-ended. And if it is open-ended, all these things we can envision, we feel so intimately relevant, are within our horizon. We're not excluding anything. So that's all I have to say.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good image, and I think I could use it as a basis to tell our listeners a little bit about what they should expect from the structure of these debates.
Right.
And I will then tell our listeners why we have picked the name we have picked for this podcast. And then you can give us a little preview of what's going to happen next in our discussions. So as you can tell, we're not big fans of hyper-specialization and these rigid boundaries between disciplines. And we really want to bring this critical approach to the field and be able to work on ambitious, open-ended, and dialectically developing ideas and projects. Of course, with these, we have some ideas, and what Trent was mentioning about modernity, that's very important, and questions about universality, particularity, the nature of a society, what is culture, what is thinking, what is the difference between thinking and all sorts of other things. It is these basic questions are going to be our sources, and we're not just going to only chat about them in this casual way of just having in a statement. We're going to work on books. We are going to focus on texts. We're going to use texts as our beginning point. These texts, Trent will tell us what these texts are going to be at the beginning, but the list is itself dialectically structured. What does that mean? That means that based on our basic ideas and questions, we started somewhere, and we made this pledge that let the experience of that discussion lead us to the next one. What that means is that you might listen to a series of episodes that we are talking about intellectual history. Then we talk about very hardcore philosophy. Then we might be pushed to modern day information theory, and so mathematical modeling, and maybe a book on economics. That's the nature of what we are doing. We are doing what we cannot do as a member of academia anymore. I don't know if this is new, or that's what is happening, but it's this type of movement of, okay, if Hegel's logic leads us to evolutionary biology, we will do that. We are not afraid of moving around if moving around is justified based on discussion, based on our needs, based on the questions that we have. We will do it. We do not have the conclusion yet. We don't even know if we ever reach the conclusion, but we dare to try. And here it comes, our name, Versucher. Versucher is a very interesting name or concept in German, because it both means experimenting and attempting, and also tempting. It's the word temptation is also there. And the origin of this concept, the way, the place that we got it from, is Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. Now, I would like to, because some of our listeners may not be looking at the screen right now, I think it's worth it to read the part that Nietzsche talks about this. And the way that Nietzsche puts it is rather enigmatic, and I will just only mention the short part of this. But then I have another quote from Goethe, and with that, I think we can have a better view of why we are Versucher, in what sense we are Versucher. So Nietzsche tells us in section 42 of Beyond Good and Evil that a new species of philosophers is coming. I venture to baptize them with a name that is not free of danger. These philosophers of the future may have a right, it might also be a wrong, to be called attempters, Versucher. This name itself is in the end a mere attempt, and if you will, a temptation. So you see that how Nietzsche himself is playing with the name, and the name itself is an attempt. With Goethe, who we dearly love, and he is gonna show up at some point in our discussions, we have another code that might give a little bit more flesh to this skeleton of what is this attempt. And this is from the place that I have found. This is a book, a biography of Goethe, which is fascinating, a fascinating book. Goethe, Life as a Work of Art by Rüdiger Safransky. And this is from a letter that Goethe wrote in September of 1780. He says, "This desire to raise up as high as possible the pyramid of my existence, whose basis and foundation were given to me, outweighs everything else and can hardly be forgotten even for a moment. I dare not tarry. I am already at an advanced age, and perhaps fate will break me in the middle of life, and the Tower of Babel will remain an incomplete stump. At least they should be able to say it was a daring attempt." And that's who we are, my friends. That's what we prefer to be. To attempt at this grandiose level, at this basic level, to take the risk, the danger in attempting to get to that place, and fail, instead of sticking to pedantic, predictable, shallow, not only thinking, but a way of life. Indeed. And this is very much present in someone like Goethe's life, that this attempt is not the very distinction between an intellectual attempt and an attempt in life is itself suspended. This is not a mere intellectual attempt, as if this intellectual attempt is excluded from the rest of our lives. This attempt is comprehensive. And what you're going to hear in these episodes is our best way to get the energy there, to get the energy to the point of digging and not finding and finding something and clinging to it and following it to wherever it takes.
All right. Thanks for that manifesto. I sign my name, pledged my life to this noble cause. So, dear listeners, just a quick preview of the books that we will discuss as a basic point. And as Aran mentioned, that we don't have a definitive reading list whatsoever. We will let our text lead us. If we are seduced by a certain question, we'll set down everything and just dive into completely new and the dangerous terrain, whatever it may cost. So our starting point is a elegantly written collection of essays from Sir Isaiah Berlin, which was recommended to me by a dear friend of mine, William. And It focuses on the Enlightenment, counter-Enlightenment debate, given my and our shared interest and the emphasis on the concept of modernity. So there we will feature three great thinkers, counter-Enlightenment critiques who were very much questioning the fundamental assumptions certain Enlightenment thinkers held in their time. And there were Vico, Hamann, and Herder. We'll start with there, and then we will gradually introduce the guide our co-theorist or the philosophy we would like or thinker would like to think with for the beginning of this experiment, at least, that is Hegel, by whatever resources available suggested by Aran, and then we'll just let it open. We will flirt with legal theory, economics, cultural anthropology, media, everything that structures our contemporary way of life. As Aran mentioned, our experiment, our project is not just an intellectual enterprise as it is narrowly defined, but it involves a reflection of the way of life, habit of hearts. So the means of communication, the social, economic, political institutions that shape our life must be taken under our scrutiny. And we will try our best to connect these ground worldviews and concepts like modernity, cultural identities with even the most detailed and day-to-day imprints such contemporary institutions left on us. So that's the idea, and that's about it.
I think with that, we are ready to begin. Hope you guys join us and see you guys very soon.